So welcome to everybody. It's lovely to see your names and some of your faces and think how we've all been over the last few months. I feel we've been in touch because Joan has been doing her wonderful usual job of sending out messages, and Lawrence has been doing quizzes, which I've enjoyed very much, and I expect many of you have as well. Thank you for that, Lawrence, and don't be shy about doing them as often as you like, because I think they give great pleasure. It would be nice perhaps to say thank you to the people who are supporting us, to Wixham Tree and Steel Charitable Trust, because they're still funding us, even though things are so difficult, and we're very grateful. And also the people like Neville's Funeral Service and the Luton Choral Service Society, who have been putting things, you know, in the programme over the years and being so kind and supportive. That's really nice. And we're very grateful to them. And perhaps an opportunity to say thank you to Maisie Bond, because she left us such a generous bequest in her will, and we decided to, any of the expenses of this series of talks, we're going to pay for out of Maisie's kind bequest. I hope she would think that was a worthwhile way of spending that. There will be money left over, so we'll put that towards some concerts as well. But we thought it'd be really nice to think of her as we're all in each other's homes and listening to these talks, which I hope you'll find interesting. I hope we're going to have concerts at the end of the year, but it seems a bit optimistic to be planning to be back in a public venue at the end of November. But I don't want to cancel them yet. The musicians are on standby and are very eager to perform. And if they can't perform because we don't have a venue, then we'll defer the concert and have them next year. But fingers crossed, we might be able to get back into the churches before the end of the year, so we have some live music making back in Luton. I think that's all the sort of general chat. I think it's time to welcome our guest and invite Petroc to sign in. Petroc, please join us. Are you there, Petroc? Yes.
Can you hear me?
I can. Oh, and lovely. I can see you as well, which is even better.
Well, I can see you with your Grove Dictionary of Music.
Well, that's a nice thing. This Grove Dictionary of Music was given to me by Chris Thomas. Well,
really?
by Liz. And so Liz was sort of, you know, tidying out things and looking at all Chris's music books when he died so sadly. Is it 2 years? I lost track of the time. But she said, would you like Chris's Grove? So it's made me tidy my bedroom, and here I am with
From
the Grove.
Albinoni to Zemlinsky.
Yes, that's right. Very good. There it is.
Maybe I'll go further either way, but I can't quite. Yeah.
You've done very well to remember the word Zemlinsky. So here we are, launching our short series of talks entitled "Why Music Matters," and I'm sure that Petroc will be an excellent choice. He's the president of our club, Luton Music.
Which is a great honour.
A great honour, great. And as a broadcaster and a journalist, a public speaker, your life is consumed with music. So let's ask you this simple question: why does music matter?
I think it matters because it sort of proves we're alive, really. It proves that we can be stimulated and excited by notes on the page coming to life. I think it's kind of at the essence of defining us as civilized human beings, and that doesn't necessarily just mean classical music. That applies to all sorts of music. It applies to literature, it applies to the visual arts, to theatre. All forms of culture, I think, just remind us of what it means to be active, engaged human beings, and that's why it's important.
Yeah, I think that's so much truth in there. Now, we're going to explore a little bit of your background, because we know you and love you, and always grateful when you come to our concerts. You were born, I think, in Worcester, and
yes,
and then grew up quite famously in Cornwall.
It's always slightly tricky, the Worcester bit, because I like to define myself as being Cornish. So the fact that on my passport it says place of birth Worcester is slightly inconvenient to that argument. My dad, like your father, my dad was in the army most of his professional career. He retired when he was 55, and he was posted to Worcester when I was born. So that's why we were there. One of my brothers was born in the military hospital in Rheindahlen in Germany. Another was born in Singapore, and they were posted there. And Worcester was where I turned out. I mean, there's the old line about Jesus being born in a stable, but he's not a donkey. So I sort of used that to define myself as being definitively Cornish. And I only lived in Worcester for 6 months of my life. Curiously, I've only been back twice, actually. In my life, and then we were in, and now there's another connection, because then we were in West Byfleet, where my dad worked in the Ministry of Defence, living in a military quarter in a street called Dodds Crescent, where I think you and your father lived a couple of years earlier.
That's right. We lived in 24 Dodds Crescent, and of course I was born in Singapore, like your brother, you know, because my dad was doing the same tour of duty. So we did, when we found these connections, we were quite excited. And the fact that we've shared time in Dodds Crescent, we might have even had the same little bedroom, who knows, gosh.
And I haven't been back to Dodds Crescent either, but my dad left the army when I was 5, and then he bought his mother's house, which he'd been born in, and which his grandfather had lived in before. And that was our return to Cornwall. And I then was in Cornwall until I left home aged 18. So I think I can justifiably call myself Cornish.
Well, I was going to ask you, because these days, you know, somebody as erudite and articulate as yourself, automatically when you leave school, you would go to university these days, but you didn't do that. You went straight into some sort of employment, isn't that right?
Yeah, it is. And I, that wasn't entirely my plan. I sort of had a very good couple of years in the 6th form, doing everything but studying, really. I was in the school play, I was co-editing the school magazine, I was broadcasting a bit for a local commercial radio station in Plymouth, and I was doing a bit of writing for the West Briton and Royal Cornwall Gazette, the wonderful weekly newspaper in Cornwall. So I was kind of very focused on all of that, and I was very determined that I wanted to have a career as a broadcaster and a journalist. And then I suddenly realized, oh goodness gracious, coming crashing towards me were my A-levels, which I hadn't done nearly enough work for. So I sort of scraped through. I did English history, religious education, which I failed. So that was the one I really did no work for, but I passed the other two, and politics, which I got an A for, but I figured that was really about just reading the newspapers. But it wasn't really enough to get me into one of the universities I wanted to go to. So I figured, well, either I can go somewhere not even on my list, or I can take a year off and then go as a mature student when you get interviewed, and it's not just based on your A-level results. So I thought, that's what I'll do. I got a job with the BBC, which again, I'm not sure you'd be able to do now without a degree, actually, but I got a trainee job with the BBC as a local radio reporter in Exeter. And then I thought, oh, I'll do 2 years, I'm really enjoying this. And then I got offered a job in Hong Kong, and I went and did that. And then I got offered a job at Classic FM, and suddenly I was 27 and hadn't been to university. And well, I've never quite said never. It's something I might do as a mature student, who knows, but I haven't done it so far.
But it's interesting to me. I mean, I would describe you as one of the finest classical music broadcasters in the world. And, you know, I've traveled the world myself and listened to, you know, the comparable services offered elsewhere on our great world. But I hope it's not rude to say that although you always loved music, music wouldn't have been the most obvious choice, because it's become quite a niche thing. And so what was it that made you decide that the Classic FM job in 1992 was going to be a golden opportunity for you?
Well, it's funny because I mean, I grew up with music. I mean, my mum had been a church organist and was a good amateur pianist. She wanted me to do my piano grades. I got up to grade 5, and then, but it was all, I had this wonderful teacher called Betty Sidday, who taught in a house on Bass Point, the most southerly part of the English mainland on the Lizard Peninsula. There's a Lloyd's signal station, a Coast Guard lookout, and next to it Bass Point House, where Betty Sidday lived with her grand piano and the windows rattling in the wind, and you had to sort of wend your way along the coast path to get to her house for lessons. And she used to wear slightly moth-bitten furs, and had 2 little Pekingese dogs that yapped. And she'd had a career as a pianist in India, and had a great love in India. And I think something had happened. I think perhaps he died. It was a little unclear, and it wasn't the sort of thing I, as a 12-year-old, was going to ask her, but there was some great tragedy, and she'd come back from India, where she was going to stay forever, to And she didn't come from Cornwall. She'd sort of gone to the furthest point away from London where she came from. She was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful teacher. But I wasn't the greatest pupil, I suppose. I didn't practice enough, inevitably. And my mum very sadly died when I was 12. And after she died, the sort of impetus to study music my father had so many other things going on. He was suddenly a single parent. He was suddenly bringing up me, and he wasn't particularly interested in music, so wasn't going to kind of continue that enthusiasm my mum had, and I stopped, and it is one of my big regrets. But music was there, and my mum used to take me from the age of 5 to lots of concerts. We had a fabulous festival in Truro, then the Three Spires Festival. I remember hearing great conductors and great soloists there. Prussia Cove, the International Musicians Seminar, we go to all their concerts. So music was very much part of my early life, and then it sort of went away after Mum died. And then I was working I'd gone to work for British Forces Radio in Hong Kong, and I was having a great old time, loving it actually. And I was offered a job working for RTHK, which is the government broadcaster in Hong Kong, presenting a news program there. And I'd signed up to do that when I got a phone call from a man called Michael Bucht, also known as Michael Barry, who was the crafty cook on Food and Drink, that BBC program. And he was setting up Classic FM, and one of his team had heard me doing a broadcast in Hong Kong, and they were looking for a presenter at very short notice because someone had pulled out, and he thought I'd be right for it. And I did this tape and I played it to someone, and they said, "It's not very good. If you don't want the job, send it. But I think you should do it again, make it better, because Hong Kong, it's not going to be a great place to have a career post 1997. That turned out to be sadly very true. So I did a better tape. I sent it off. And then a week later, I was back in Camden Town. And 2 weeks later, I think Classic FM was on air. And there I was with all of us stumbling around. None of us were quite sure what we were doing. But amazingly, within about 3 months, Classic FM had 3 million listeners and was an enormous success, and I think did change the face of classical music appreciation.
I do remember how it was a little bit ad hoc and invented on the spot, because that's how we met, wasn't it? You thought, I'll have a guest for my Christmas program. And you rang up and said, would we appear on Christmas Day live on your program? And we said, no, we're having Christmas. He said, would you come into the studio 2 days beforehand, eat mince pies, and pretend you're in my studio on Christmas Day? Which I think is what we did. And we had such fun doing it, and we haven't stopped talking ever since.
No, exactly. And it was, I mean, they were very keen to do live music on Classic FM right from the beginning. And they had a slot at 11 o'clock each night for young artists. But unlike the BBC, where you'd have a degree of quality control because you'd have, I don't know, half a dozen producers working across a strand like that, this strand was done by one producer who produced a whole 3-hour program, one of which was an hour of live music. He had to balance it himself as well as producing it. There was no engineer to give a second pair of ears. He had to go around the open plan office unplugging all the telephones before 11 o'clock in case any of them rang during the broadcast. And he also had to audition all the acts. And the acts would send in cassettes, because it was pre-CD or downloads or anything, of their performance. And I remember the very young Ian Bostridge making his broadcast debut, singing Schubert Lieder. He was sort of, 21, 22, still an undergraduate at Oxford. Roddy Williams, who again was a kind of session singer at that point, he came in and sang on that slot. But every so often you get people who were terrible, who basically had recorded Brendel playing Mozart, sent it in, and of course they were booked. And every so often we get about 10 minutes into the slot. Adrian Love used to present it, and poor Declan would have to invent technical problems and say, "I'm so sorry, we've got terrible technical problems. We can't continue with the live broadcast as these people hand their way around the keyboard, playing half the notes, all the notes, but not necessarily in the right order, etc." And but it was exciting, and it was pioneering, and it was brave, and it was the sort of thing the BBC would never have taken a risk on. And often it worked. Sometimes it didn't work, but often it did. Classic doesn't do that sort of thing anymore. It's become a much slicker operation now, much smaller staff, much more computer programmed, and playing great hits. And there's a very important role for it doing that. But it was exciting to be there in those early days when it did feel quite pioneering.
It was a heady time. Now, part of our remit for this series of talks is to refresh the idea that music is important, and that even perhaps in ways that we don't understand. It affects our lives, you know, in a way that's outside deductive reasoning, you could say. Now, when I listened a few weeks ago to your broadcast of the first night of the proms, I got a sense that you were genuinely touched by that occasion, because you've been
Yes.
inspired to write a poetic link into Copeland's Quiet City, which I thought was a genius piece of programming. But it was your bit about pigeons roosting in the rafters of St Pancras. I happen to know you love trains, so that will have meant a lot to you. But can you explain to us why an occasion like that was so special for you?
Well, I mean, I think quite simply, it was the remarkable sight of an orchestra on stage. Goodness, a year ago, we'd have thought there's nothing strange about that. We could have gone to, in London, probably 15 orchestral concerts every week, maybe more. We had a live orchestral concert from somewhere in the UK every night of the week, or 6 nights of the week on Radio 3. There seemed to be nothing strange or startling about that. And some of the concerts were absolutely amazing, incredible experiences. Some of them were a bit more workaday and perhaps didn't catch fire in quite the same way, but it didn't matter. There was live music. There was live music on offer every night. We had a weekly concert in Luton during the season. And then suddenly all of that had been swept away. So the sight of an orchestra back on stage of the Royal Albert Hall was in itself very exciting, very special, very unusual. But then there were all sorts of other things that made it different. There was something tragic, almost wonderful and tragic, about the sight of the bust of Henry Wood caught in a spotlight, as ever on the first night of the proms, and yet with no audience to cheer him. There was the vast empty space of the Royal Albert Hall. There was the fact that the orchestra, the BBC Symphony Orchestra, which has 80 players, only 40 of them were on stage, because that was all that were allowed with the required distancing. The fact that string players were all on separate desks 2.5 meters apart, which caused little problems that you wouldn't think about, like how do you had to plan page turns much more carefully than you would normally to avoid everybody turning their page at the same time. Listening to the Eroica Symphony, you were hearing parts individually, and your brain had to sort of slightly work out how to listen to get a kind of an orchestral sound. So it was remarkable that music was happening again, but it was also so completely different to anything we'd known before. I think probably the hardest part was actually for singers who were giving song recitals, perhaps at Wigmore, or were singing at the proms. You know, singing out, not marking, singing out at full volume without an audience. I think perhaps that's the most difficult thing, and with no other musician to look at. You know, the pianist behind you or the orchestra behind you. At least if you're in a string quartet or an orchestra, you can at least see other people. So it was everything was different, and yet there was also the glory of the fact that music was perhaps, now we're going to say briefly, but music was back. It
may be why we're connecting so much at the moment with radio presenters, because what you do is that the whole time you speak to an empty space, but connected with thousands and thousands of people. So it doesn't matter to you. Your regular broadcast spot is the Radio 3 breakfast show at 6:30 to 9 every morning. And I wonder if you get a sort of buzz out of being the start to a lot of civilized routines all over the country. And I also wonder whether there's a sense of feeling very pleased with yourself that by 9 o'clock you've done a day's work.
Well, that's certainly true. There's a bit more than that, but I lie if I say there's much more.
I mean, I know, just for example, that of course your day doesn't stop at 9 o'clock. It starts at 6:30 and it goes on to 9 o'clock in the evening.
It starts at 4:45 to be precise on my alarm.
I beg your pardon. But don't you have a lovely walk across?
Yeah, I do. And it's funny because I never thought of myself as being a morning person. I mean, I'd always broadcast in the afternoon. And after I worked at Classic FM, I did a show on LBC for a couple of years that was very much based around theatre and the arts. So I was out every night at the theatre or seeing something and interviewing people afterwards, and, you know, rolling in at 1 o'clock in the morning and getting up at 9. And at Radio 3, I mainly was doing concerts in the evening, and then standing in for Sean on In Tune some of the time. So when they said, "Will you do breakfast?" It was. I'd done it before. I did it for about a year at Radio 3. I'd done it at BFBS, done it in local radio. So I knew about getting up. But somehow it sort of. I think I was 40 when they asked me to start doing it, and it just kind of worked rather well. I suddenly found it was much easier to get up early in the morning than it had been before, and that I could just wake up and get going. And I rather enjoy it now. I mean, when I'm off, I was off for a couple of weeks until this morning, and I still we've had various phases of doing the program from Radio 2 studios when they've been refurbishing, and their studios are on the 6th floor, Western House, next door to Broadcasting House, and have windows, and it's so fantastic. Our studio is in the bowels of literally in the core of Broadcasting House. It actually used to be what the Radio 3 studio is now. Used to be the chapel of Broadcasting House, and it was a consecrated chapel when the building opened, where morning service was broadcast from. So where the desk that I sit at is now, there was an altar, and there are wonderful pictures of it done out in a sort of Art Deco church style, but there are no windows, so you sit there blissfully unaware of whether it's raining or sunny or snowing or
God, what a change. Quite a lot of terrible sins have been committed in that space now. I've been responsible.
Music, certainly.
And I know how difficult you find it to resist the opportunity to broadcast in the evening sometimes. And when the proms are on, and somebody asks you to present a prom, you have to do it. And then because you get tickets, people like me are lucky enough to be invited to sit in the Radio 3 box. And then,
well, not this year, alas, because the only way we could get the proms on this year was with a massive kind of health and safety policy. I mean, a document this thick, and one-way routes, and only certain people were allowed in certain spaces, and we all had separate entrances and exits and allocated loos and things. I mean, of course, reality is most people forgot quite quickly what the rules were, and you suddenly realised you were going the wrong way. But so that meant all of that was gone, and there was that sad thing this year of no audience. And it was impossible. No one was allowed to even the controller of Radio 3 wasn't allowed in. He had to watch. It was strictly people who were necessary, which was a shame. I mean, I think we probably could have got an audience in, actually, and I think we perhaps missed a trick there. I'm not sure whether that was a BBC decision or whether that was a Royal Albert Hall decision.
When I was listening to your broadcasts, I was wondering whether, as usual, when you'd been introducing the Berlin Phil, we would all then teeter over to the Polish club, and at 11:30 you'd say, "I really must go to bed because I have to be up in half an hour." But was there any sort of conviviality after these ones, or did you?
Yes, the Polish club was still going strong, actually. So we did it. I mean, that was slightly the ridiculous thing. It's the ridiculous thing about this whole COVID, isn't it? That there we are, dutifully sitting miles apart in the Royal Albert Hall, and then suddenly the conductor and the presenter and the producer and things are sharing a table in a restaurant. I mean, it's trying to keep all the kind of rules together, isn't it? Although the great thing about that place is you can sit outside, which I think made it a huge difference. But there was a little bit of that. But again, that was very sad, because walking out of the Royal Albert Hall after a prom, and the South Steps had kind of tumbleweed blowing down them, no promers. The Imperial College Union, which
I wonder,
was completely shut up. The Nines, which is the pub where traditionally the orchestra players go, shut up. I mean, it was very sad.
I wonder, with the news having been so monothematic for the last 2.5 years, so we had 18 months of Brexit, and now we've had 9 months of COVID. Whether that's been part of the reasons for the drift of listeners away from Radio 4 in the morning, the Today programme, and because your figures seem to be doing well, and perhaps people need a gentler start to the day.
Yeah, I mean, I must be careful what I say, because we haven't had any audience figures since this year, really, because of the way they're gathered. COVID means that they haven't been able to gather them accurately. There certainly seems to be some evidence that more people are listening, but who knows? We certainly did pick up some listeners last year, and I think you're right. I think there is a bit of a sense that the news has become very single agenda, and has been now for 3 years. Whether it's the endless circle of the rights and wrongs, or wrongs and rights of Brexit, and now COVID. And I think, you know, that people are a bit frustrated by it. You can sort of, and also it's much easier to get your news in other ways now. You know, you can access a range of newspapers, you can look at social media, you can, you know, listen to podcasts or listen to the Today program when you want to listen to it, or listen to the World at Once. So today's a fantastic program with brilliant presenters, and, you know, is the greatest morning news program in the world. There's no question about that. But I also wonder, I was listening, there was a lovely program, I don't know if anyone heard it, on last Saturday on Radio 4 at 8 o'clock, looking back over Sue McGregor's broadcasting career, starting in South Africa and then coming here and presenting Woman's Hour and Today and The Reunion and Good Read and commentating and various other things. And just listening back to that, you know, and listening to her interviewing Mrs. Thatcher and some of her cabinet ministers, and then some of the Blair government ministers and some of the people around it, just everyone sounded a bit more fun somehow, and a bit more kind of interesting and a bit more outspoken. You know, now you get ministers coming on and everyone's parroting exactly the same line that's been agreed, presumably by Dominic Cummings, and just kind of repeating it. And it just makes it not so interesting. You know, we seem to have lost, in politics, we seem to have lost those kind of mavericks that made it a bit more interesting.
I mean, I've seen you front big TV shows, things like Cardiff Singer of the World, which I know many of the members of the club have enjoyed. Leeds International Piano Competition. You even did Eurovision at one point, I think.
I did, yeah. Eurovision Choir and Eurovision Young Musician.
Yeah,
Not
you do it brilliantly, but I hope this isn't impertinent, but I would suggest your very best work, like Terry Wogan, has been done on the radio. And I wonder, do you think it's that radio is a better medium for classical music, or is it to do with your professionalism as a journalist, or your personality, or is it that people want a reassuring thread of continuity, somebody they connect with every day as the tapestry increasingly seems to unravel with each day that passes?
I think maybe a bit of that. I mean, I think the joy of radio for me certainly is its simplicity. It hardly needs anyone to do it. You know, I mean, in order that we have the best sound and the best balance, we have an engineer in the studio at the moment. We have me, and we have a producer. And normally the producer in normal times would be in the studio, but because of the limited number of people in Broadcasting House, the producers are working from home. And some of my colleagues have been broadcasting from home as well. But I decided to keep going in. I live in Camden Town, so it's a sort of 10-minute ride in the morning. But that's it. It's 3 people, and actually, in an emergency, if the engineer overslept or the producer, I could kind of probably get through it on my own just about. It wouldn't sound great, but I could do it. Whereas, you know, to get anything on television sort of requires probably 50 or 60 people. You know, it requires 6 cameramen, 3 sound men, a floor manager, people to lay the cables, people to make sure all the power's working, lighting staff, makeup, costume, people running the scanner where everything's put together. And that's not overstaffing in any way. I mean, these things are done on as few staff as possible these days, but simply the nature of TV means it does take a lot more people, and therefore it's a team. And there's something very, very exciting on those occasions when I do Cardiff Singer, or I did the Commonwealth Day service for the BBC back in March. There's something really exciting about being part of a big team doing an event, and I love it. But I suppose what I really enjoy doing is live radio, and for me it's a huge treat to do television things from time to time, but it's sort of radio where I'm very happy. And I think it is that nature of one-to-one communication. You know, I remember my first boss at the BBC was a fabulous Liverpudlian called Roy Corlett, who was tough and you know, told you when he thought things were bad, but also told you when he thought things were good. He was a chain smoker. He used to hold his cigarette like this in the corner of his mouth and press the talk back and tell you how terrible he thought something was or how good something was. But he said, you've just got to remember when you're broadcasting, you're talking to one person. Never refer to you, our listeners, or plurals about listeners. It's one talking or whatever. And I think that's what makes it very interesting.
Oh, here it was the television going.
Try again, Petroc. You were interrupted.
Oh no, I just think that one-to-one nature, I'd finished. that one-to-one nature, I think, is what makes it very intimate. That it's one person talking into a microphone and thinking of one listener. There might be 500,000 people listening, but I think you're aiming it at one person. And that's
what I admire when you're broadcasting, you have your script and you have that gift of making something that you've written so carefully sound spontaneous and of the moment. But you are at your happiest when you're improvising, when something happens, when the conductor is late coming onto the platform and you have to fill. But you're so disciplined about the way you do it. It would be quite easy to become self-indulgent and talk about the majesty of the building and love the sound of your own voice. But you're very good about finessing that with prepared material. I want to talk a little bit.
Kind of you to say. I did have. It is fun. I mean, the joy of one of the joys is when something goes wrong and you have, or not goes wrong, but when there's a delay or you have to. The Commonwealth Day thing I did back in March, only a week before lockdown. It was my first kind of big event for the BBC. I'd done the Lord Mayor's show a couple of times, but my first royal event for the BBC, and I was just praying that the COVID wouldn't close it down. But obviously the Queen decided she was going to be there. But it turned out to be quite a big thing because it was Harry and Meghan's last public appearance. And there was a kind of one of those fabulous BBC battle royals between the events team, who are very closely linked to the palace, who felt very much that this was an event about the Queen and the Commonwealth, and the BBC One team, who again, we want to see lots of Harry and Meghan because kind of that's what everyone is interested in. And it was decided that we would stay on air until they finally left. And you get that shot, which would mean so much in a very strange way, of Harry and Meghan literally driving off into the sunset. And everything just got later and later. And we were told we had to be off air at 4:01. And they were still in the building at 4:01. And I kept getting this message from the producer: they've given us another 2 minutes. They've given another 3 minutes, another 2 minutes, another 4 minutes. And we were on air, I think, until 4:18, which in TV terms is an eternity. I mean, you know, careers have been lost over 15 minutes of broadcasting. And for me, and I was working with Robert Hardman, who's the Mail's fantastic royal correspondent. It was just joyous because we had plenty to say. The Abbey looked fantastic. It was an extraordinary moment that here was the much loved young prince and his still relatively new wife, whose wedding we'd all watched or at least been aware of 18 months previously, and suddenly everything was different. And this was a moment. This was the end of something. This was someone leaving the royal family at a young age, and it was very exciting to be doing it. I have to say, I kind of enjoyed myself enormously.
In the copy that accompanied the publicity for these talks, I wrote that you have witnessed the transformative effect of classical music across the world and will share those insights with us here in Luton. But I know you're so widely travelled that you could bring anecdotes from every corner of the world, I know. But I wonder if you'd share a little bit of the tale of that African adventure that we undertook together some 8 years ago, because it was quite...
You should tell this.
Well... you talked me into it.
It's true, isn't it? Because it all started when Graham Johnson, who you'll know, I know, the fantastic pianist, song pianist. Graham is Zimbabwean, or Rhodesian as he would call it, because he left a decade before Rhodesia became Zimbabwe. And he grew up in Bulawayo, the second city of Zimbabwe, and went to the Zimbabwe Academy of Music. And obviously is its star pupil of all time. And Graham, who I know a bit, said, look, there's a guy who runs the academy, which amazingly, he said, it's still going. You know, all you hear about Zimbabwe is it costs you $100 trillion to buy a loaf of bread, which is true. I've got a $100 trillion banknote over there somewhere. Farmers are losing their livelihood, schools are collapsing, terrible HIV/AIDS rate, a failing country. And yet he said, amazingly, this music academy is still going, and kids are coming in and learning the violin and the cello and the piano. And it's all thanks to this guy called Michael Bullivant. And he's this guy from Peterborough who did Latin at Oxford and then went out to teach Latin at a school in Rhodesia then, Zimbabwe now. I don't think there's much Latin taught now, but stayed on and runs the academy. And he said, would you write something about it? So I wrote a piece about it for The Spectator. And then Michael was coming over to London, and I met up with him and he said, yeah, I've got this festival. Will you come and be part of it? And I thought, well, I'm kind of a bit nervous about going on my own, but if I could find a couple of friends to go, or a friend. And this was when Richard was still performing in that long forgotten cabaret duo, Kit and the Widow. So you both came out and did a show. I remember in the 400-seat concert hall at the Academy. And you and I think, you know, we had a great time and we were fascinated by it. And it's a country of extraordinary beauty. And I know we went to the Metopas National Park, just a couple of an hour's drive outside Bulawayo, and we're just delighted by it. But we both said on the plane back, I wonder if there's something we could do a bit more here. And I wonder if we could help the Academy, and we could sort of help it find ways of not necessarily raise up money ourselves, but help it find other ways of raising money. And we set up a charity, which is still, it's sort of paused at the moment, but it is still existent, called the British Friends of the Zimbabwe Academy of Music. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to just help Michael understand really that if he wanted to get money from organizations like British Council, for example, he had to make it a bit more integrated. It was still very much a white organization, you know, in a country where 2 or 3% of the population is now white. Sort of 50 or 60% of the pupils at the Academy were white. So we said, look, we can help you with this, and then we can introduce you to the British Council. And we did manage to make happen this fantastic project that lasted 3 years, where we raised, I think, about 10,000 a year, and the British Council put in 30,000 a year to teach teachers in the townships of Bulawayo how to teach music to their children and how to engage them in music making. And it was a really worthwhile project. It sort of came to a natural end, largely because of the further collapse of Zimbabwe, and British Council had always seen it as a 3-year project. But it did inspire a lot of teachers and a lot of young people, I think. And you know, maybe 1 or 2 people will go on and take more of a focus on music in their lives as a result. But it felt an important and a worthwhile thing to do. And along the way, we did Richard wrote a couple of what would you call them? Oratorios, cantatas, I suppose.
Community cantatas.
Community cantatas with math, one of which had 500 kids in it and 100 adults. And we performed in the City Hall in Bulawayo. It was so popular, we had to do it twice in one day. Richard conducted the Zimbabwean premiere of Carmina Burana. We had the Zimbabwe, I mean, basically anything you do is a Zimbabwe premiere. That was the fun of it, apart from possibly a bit of Beethoven. We did Jesus' Blood Never Failed Me by Gavin Bryars, who created a sort of new version for us to do in Zimbabwe. And I think we went probably about half a dozen times, didn't we?
Yeah, the Gavin Bryars was an African premiere. It wasn't just a Zimbabwean premiere.
An African premiere, right.
But when you say
then we got asked, I got myself arrested and then deported, and that was the end of it, really. And
well, you say we did 2 performances of the Carnival of the Carnivals, but actually we did 1 7/8 because what
you did too. You did too.
Well, I did too. So I'm at the piano, surrounded by wonderful children playing kazoos and recorders and violins, and then 500 kids behind us singing. And Petroc,
the South African String Quartet. It was a very odd mix.
Wonderful, from the Bloemfontein University. And you were the narrator. And towards the end, you're supposed to come on, and across the great savannah disappear the tales of the beautiful giraffe, and so on. And suddenly you weren't there. And I thought, where is he? Well, I'll just play a bit more. So I was filling out, wondering what happened. And I said to myself, oh, I know what he's doing. I know I've given a lot to this project. They've got a cake and they're going to bring it on. They're going to make a big presentation. They're going to thank me for everything I've done. I really hate that sort of thing. We just don't need it, but I'll have to be gracious. And I was running out of chords. Anyway, nothing. And suddenly somebody came and tapped me on the shoulder and said, they've taken Petroc away. So I put down the tonic chord and the concert was over. And they didn't like your paperwork, and they had come, they'd heard about the concert.
Yes.
And arrested in front of a crowd of 2,000 proud parents. They'd arrested Petroc and marched him away and put him in.
Chucked me into a Black Maria, which was literally an old-fashioned Black Maria police car.
So I didn't know what to do. Anyway, we were having a reception afterwards with the High Commissioner. And so I said, is there any news? She said, well, you know, the thing is Friday night, so he'll definitely be in the weekend, and it's Africa Day on Monday, so nothing will happen there. Nothing can happen till Tuesday. So what I suggest is we don't worry about it, and we just have a nice drink and sit down and have a good meal. I said, oh, I can't quite do that when my buddy is in a jail.
I was horrified. I thought she showed the perfect example of a stiff upper lip in the event of a crisis, and I would have done exactly the same thing. And I thought you were making far too much of it. But actually, what was very good, I had a night in a jail cell with 18 of us sharing a cell. It was quite intimate, and we had lots of friends. We got to know lots of people there, including lots of people who were involved in the MDC, the opposition party led by Morgan Tsvangirai, who incredibly brave people, because the sort of the thugs employed by Mugabe's regime would think of nothing of really causing people horrific injuries just because they were trying to engage in the democratic process. And they were well used to visiting activists who were being chucked in prison all the time. So the next morning, a group of them turned up at the police station where I was being held, and they knew the way to handle it and the way to make my life much better was by coming with, because there's no food in a police station in Zimbabwe. So they brought with them not one bacon roll, but 18 bacon rolls, 18 cartons of fruit juice, 18 scones, 18 apples. And of course it meant I was then kingpin in the cell, because I was, you know, clearly while I was around, everybody was going to be looked after very lavishly in terms of the catering. And that certainly made my life, I mean, not that my life was in any way unpleasant the first night, but it made me a little bit more reassured the next couple of nights.
I think you were a slight disappointment to your cellmates in that because you were English, or Cornish at least, they thought you'd be an expert on football, and you knew,
yes.
It turned out you knew almost nothing about football.
Yeah, I mean, it was at the constant, because we talked all night actually, and I mean, it was like literally questions being fired about so many different things, about kind of London, about civil rights in the UK, about politics, about Tony Blair. Everyone was obsessed with Tony Blair. I mean, this was, no, it was 2012, wasn't it? So he'd long ceased to be Prime Minister, but there was a lot of interest in him about football, about cars, about prices. I was asked so many prices of things, you know, from a bar of chocolate to a Porsche, and everything in between. But it genuinely was an interesting experience. I mean, it's not necessarily one I choose to repeat, but it wasn't. I managed to dislocate my shoulder, which I think lots of people chose to decide was an act of violence, but it actually wasn't. It was me falling over in the cell entirely of my own volition. But actually, that was the best thing that could happen, because that meant I was whisked eventually to the hospital nearby, and a very nice Malawian doctor there who'd had run-ins with the authorities himself said, I know exactly what they'll do, so I'm going to say that you can't leave the hospital until it's safe for you to leave the country. And that was a huge relief, actually. And in the end, we went to court, and it was me versus the state of Zimbabwe, and we had a triumphant victory. I had a wonderful lawyer called Munyaradzina Zarapenga, who I'm still in touch with. And then the authorities said, right, you've won, so we're going to take you out of the country. It's time for you to leave. And suddenly this little head popped up, and it was the British Consul General, who'd been curious in his absence until that point, saying, we'd really appreciate if you didn't leave. You would stay for 2 or 3 more days, just to make the point that you have every right to stay. And actually, I was very pleased. I think we stayed for another, you were still there, you'd stayed, and I think we stayed for another 4 or 5 days after that. And I'm very glad we did, actually, because it was nice to leave Zimbabwe with happier memories, and see all the people who've been so kind when I was in trouble. We then tried to go back. We were going to do another project 6 months later, and Richard was already there. And I flew in to join him, having been assured there'd be no problem with my entry, and got to the front of the passport queue. And the same immigration officer who'd arrested me grabbed my passport and stamped deported on it. Well, that's that. Once that's stamped on your passport, you're out. And I managed to see Richard and the people from the academy in the security is not much of a thing at Bulawayo Airport, so everyone could kind of mingle together. And I had a couple of fruit stollen from Marks and Spencer that I'd been taking over for the director of the academy, who very much wanted them for Christmas because he hadn't had a stollen in 20 years or something. And I said, look, can I just at least leave the stollen? And the immigration officer said, okay, yes. And then I was taken off to the plane. We taxied a bit, the plane stopped, and a man ran towards the plane in a high-vis jacket. And I thought, well, that's it, they are going to let me in. And it wasn't that. That plane door opened, and he said, we can't have the Stollen left here. And he solemnly gave the Stollen in a Marks and Spencer's bag back to me. So I served at a dinner party in London 3 days later as the Stollen that had twice crossed the equator in 48 hours. Well, I haven't been back since. I'd love to go back, and I think you would too. And sadly, things have got even worse than they were then in that beautiful country, which was a very rich country, and could essentially be a first world country in Africa, but has been exporting to the world because it has so many crops and minerals and so on. But it's been so failed by its leadership, really, from the 1960s onwards, I think. And it's a great tragedy.
I'd forgotten some of the details of that, and it reminds me, your whole life is like that, I know. And we feel very honoured here at Luton Music.
I think it is. I think it certainly isn't.
You lead
box sets and
And the president, I mean, we've been going here since 1946, and it's quite a lineage. It began with Ernest Bevin, and then it was Sir Adrian Boult, and then briefly Norman Del Mar, and then Anthony Hopkins, the legendary broadcaster. And now it's you. What do you think our aims here?
Michael Barclay.
Sorry?
Wasn't Michael Barclay president?
No, he's been vice president.
Vice president.
Yes.
Right. That's very exciting that I beat him.
Yes.
In rank. I can't wait to
remind
Lord Barclay of that.
But what do you think here at Luton Music? What should we be doing in the world of today's Western art music? What do you think our aim should be?
Well, I think what Luton Music does is extraordinary anyway, isn't it? I mean, forgetting the current times, the number of concerts that you put on, there are very few music societies left that put on anywhere near the number of concerts that you put on. The versatility of location. I mean, I think the Bear Club was fantastic, and it feels very sad to me that it's no more.
Well, there's news there that it might be revived.
Go on.
Due to have a closing season, and Justin, the guy who runs it, really special chap, he really is. He had lined up all his favourite bands to have one last crack, and he was going to do a fundraising. His wife is in musical theatre, so he and his wife were going to do an evening of musical theatre with Guess Who at the piano to raise money for the local hospice, and it was going to be this great swan song, and it was all cut off because of COVID, and he was so sad about that he hasn't disassembled it, and he's now thinking that actually he might bring it back in a slightly different version. So it might be, that it's a possibility. Anyway,
But I thought it was a really interesting venue for music because I mean, it's certainly, it wasn't perfect in any way. I know for you had to get the right seats, or it could be quite uncomfortable. It's acoustically wasn't perfect. It was a bit noisy at times, but there was something, you sort of imagined almost when you went to concerts there that Haydn or Mozart might have listened to music in very similar circumstances. That idea of Mozart's works being performed in the White Horse Inn or the Red Horse Inn, whatever, Black Horse Inn, I can't remember what it was, and other taverns in
the Red Hedgehog.
The Red Hedgehog, that's right. Other taverns in Vienna, and then out in Grinsting on the side, in taverns on the side of the Vienna woods. And the idea that there would be people making a noise in the room next door, and there would be probably the sound of crashing around upstairs, and there would be the bar doing business in the corner. And it did feel to me, from that point of view, rather wonderful. And it worked very well for, I had string quartets, I had lute songs, I had song recitals, piano recitals. And it felt to me that it was rather a special venue because it wasn't trying to be a kind of act concert hall. It was saying this is an earthy venue where classical music will have to fight for attention in the same way that jazz does or folk does. And it would be amazing if it did survive in some way. I mean, I suppose the other issue music has everywhere is a sort of what's the feeder, how do we get the next generation in? And, there are so many problems there, aren't there? I mean, lack of music education in many schools is one issue. And I know that that Luton is very fortunate in that some of the schools, certainly around the city, do still have, some of the state schools do still have very good music education, but getting appreciation, getting classical music treated as something that's not somehow special. You know, I think there's a bit of a danger that we put classical music into a bubble and we say this is an elite, and there's nothing wrong with the word elite, but we say this is an exclusive form, and this is something that we must venerate and we must put up high. And actually that doesn't do us any favors. How you get people who don't all look like us in there as well is very difficult. I mean, there are an awful lot of challenges. And I think ultimately, I think these things are cyclical, and I think we're perhaps having a problem now in finding new audiences. But I think there will be a return to classical music, but we'll have to work for it. We can't just hope it will happen, because if we hope it'll happen, it'll become a more and more refined, smaller thing, and it'll just be in big cities, and then it'll just be for rich people in big cities, and then it'll only be occasionally in big cities, and then it'll fade away.
I mean, without wanting to be too pessimistic, it's reaching crisis point here in Luton, you know, which has been well served by wonderful education. The vandalism of recent changes in educational policy means that instead of 5 years ago, I would have had 17 children in an A-level class. This year I've got 2, and neither of them have come from Luton, because where there's critical need, obviously people prioritize and they have to serve the most desperate situation. And if you don't prioritize any arts education in the school, the children won't have the opportunity. So
no, and it's twofold, isn't it? It's lack of money, but it's also a sort of government policy that says doing music A level is not as valid as doing physics or maths A level. And that I sense that's broadening. I mean, you feel that there's increasingly an attack on general cultural-based humanities degrees. You know, it seems to be becoming clear that maybe a history degree or an English literature degree isn't going to be seen as valid as a maths degree or a business degree or a science degree. And I think that's very depressing. You know, it's no coincidence how many kind of doctors are also musicians and how many mathematicians are also musicians.
Well, in a couple of weeks' time,
those two things can sit together very well, but a lot of people don't seem to pick up that point.
Yes, in a couple of weeks' time, we're going to, in this series of talks, we're going to look at music education here in Luton. And a young filmmaker has made a profile of some of the young professionals who are out there earning their living as musicians at the moment. And I think it'll be very touching and very revealing. And I hope shine a light on why music is so important.
But I think that's the other point it's worth mentioning, isn't it? You know, those young musicians out there earning a living, well, they're probably not at the moment. I mean, I think that's the other issue that we really do need to address. You know, we're in grave danger of losing so much stuff because of what's happening at the moment. I mean, you know, John Gilhooly, who runs Wigmore Hall in London, is doing an amazing job putting on chamber music there, concerts every night and every lunchtime at the moment as well, and they're all available to watch. I'm introducing the Carducci Quartet playing Janacek and Brahms there tomorrow evening on the Wigmore Hall website, and that's really good, but that's giving employment to a tiny fraction of a percentage of the music industry. Orchestras aren't really playing. If they are, only half of them are playing. That means that players in the LSO and the LPO don't earn a thing because they're all freelancers. They're not staff musicians. You know, so many people talking about leaving the business. You know, Tasman Little, who's a great favourite I know in Luton, and to all of us, you know, saying that she's retiring this year, but had she not decided to retire, there's no way she would have continued in the business because she can't see a clear future for it over the next few years. And I think, you know, there were lots of plaudits for the £1.5 billion that Oliver Dowden, the Culture Secretary, managed to get from the Treasury to support the cultural sector, but the disbursement of that has now descended into kind of rather opaque, unfocused vagueness, it seems to me. No one quite knows who's being funded, what's being funded. And it's all very well to have Eat Out to help out, but actually we needed a similar scheme to support musicians, actors, dancers, people in the creative industry, which just bring in so much money into Great Britain PLC. That's the mystery to me, that, you know, the reason people come to London or come to Britain on holiday is to go to the theatre, to go to concerts, to go to the proms, to go and hear something at Wigmore Hall. And if we flush all that away, the loss to us economically is going to be so much greater than a few £billion in a package to tide things over until some sort of normality returns.
Sadly, as I predicted, Petroc, the time has flown by. I mean, we've been chattering on and probably on longer than...
And people haven't logged off, which is amazing. I thought we'd be watching. I thought it would be like like one of those premieres. Peter Maxwell Davies used to tell that brilliant story of whenever he had a premiere at the proms, as a young man, he took great delight in a sort of masochistic way of hearing the seats, the old seats in the Albert Hall, go bang as they clang shut as another 20 people left, and the doors slamming as people stormed out, furious at this avant-garde symphony he created. And then he said later on that he decided he needed to write something slightly cozier so people wouldn't do that. But as a young man, you can see the excitement of that. I thought we might have that today, the lights gradually going out, but no, people are
very good.
Still here.
I mean, it was so interesting to hear you talk about the future of music, but can we finish with something positive? What are you looking forward to in the world of music? What's bright in the future, do you think?
What's bright in the future is looking forward to the next concert at Luton Music, for example. And I'm really glad you haven't cancelled that concert in November, isn't it? And I would urge you not to, because I just think, you know, musicians who until very recently would be booking themselves up 2 years, 3 years ahead, they've all realized now that everything's changed, and actually you can be so nimble now. You can have an idea for a concert on a Monday and you can have 60 people listening to it or 100 people listening to it on the Saturday, 5 days later. That's how we're going to get through this. You know, the Wigmore Hall have been constantly changing their program as people have been stuck in places, or one member of a quartet has had to get into isolation. Don't worry, we'll move you to 2 weeks on Tuesday. We'll bring forward this person. Everybody's up for it. And I think, you know, you should leave that concert in the diary at Luton until the day before the concert, or as late as you possibly can, because I just think having those things on the horizon, you know, I bought tickets for 2 or 3 things at Wigmore, and I bought some tickets for the LSO season at the Barbican, and just I can't help thinking that stuff probably won't happen, because we're probably going back into a London lockdown sooner rather than later. But just having the ticket there and thinking, maybe, I think that's what I'm looking forward to. And it will, you know, one day soon, hopefully within this calendar year, but maybe next, we will be back there, and there will be 6,000 people at the proms, and we will be able to gather on a Monday night in the Bear Club or wherever, and the music will be happening live again, and we will forget about Zoom. Wonderful though.
Well, I mean, we
wait to say goodbye to it.
We feel blessed with Zoom to have had your company. And of course, if there aren't live concerts, we can have you every morning for 3.5 hours or whatever it is. Get up early enough. Thank you so much, Petroc.
It's been a great pleasure.
A wonderful treat for us all.
And hopefully see you in Luton in November. If it happens, I shall be there.
Please, well, that would be lovely. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in and listening. And if you've got any thoughts about how you'd like the talks to develop, do drop a note to Joan, and she'll pass on your remarks, and we'll make a plan. But next week is going to be Chi-Chi. Do you know Chi-Chi, Petroc?
I do. She's fabulous. She's a wonderful bassist and a great energy life enhancer, really. I mean, she did a request show, which I think you did the request show on Radio 3, didn't you, for a bit?
Briefly, yes.
And she did it as well for a bit. She, wonderful bass player, obviously, in the OAE, not anymore, now focusing on Chineke, and the impact Chineke has had. I'm looking forward to watching the documentary, 2 fantastic classical music documentaries on the BBC over the weekend. The reviews say they're fantastic. I haven't seen either of them yet, but about Bernard Haitink, John Brinker's documentary on Saturday, and then about black composers and black musicians that was broadcast last night, presented by my friend Susie Klein and Lenny Henry, that Chi-Chi was a contributor to. And she really has done a vast amount in a very short space of time in just opening the discussion about why there are now fewer black people percentage-wise in classical music than there are white people, and also why there are quite a few very interesting black musical figures of the past who we've forgotten about, whose music we should be listening to. And that documentary got a couple of fantastic reviews in the papers this morning, as did the Bernard Haitink documentary. So
yeah, they're both wonderful watch. I think we're very lucky to have Chi because she says she's desperately getting back from Salzburg, so she can be here for us to
if
talk.
she's in Salzburg, she'll be in quarantine, so she'll be very available to you on Zoom.
Oh, right. Well, thank goodness for that. Good night, everybody. Thank you so much for your company. And I look forward to seeing as many of you who like to join us next week as possible. But goodbye for now.